The Meze Empyrean 2 has been really well received by most reviewers so far, but I have to say I'm not quite as high on it as some other people. However, I do still think it's a great headphone, so I probably should explain what I mean. Before we get into why I feel like I do about the Empyrean 2, let me quickly introduce it. It's a $2,999 planar magnetic headphone from Meze Audio. It's a follow-up from the original Meze Empyrean, which was one of my all-time favourite headphones, still is. I actually regret selling it to this day. And as with all of the planar magnetic headphones from Meze Audio, it uses a specific driver design from a company called Renaro. It's a collaboration between Meze and Renaro. And so it uses a combination of a circular trace on the diaphragm of the headphone, as well as a switchback trace, which kind of loops back and forth on itself. And I've talked about that in previous reviews of things like the Elites and the original Empyreans, so I'm not going to go into it in detail here, but it is a slightly unique planar magnetic design. The couple of final things to mention before we dive into sound quality is that the impedance of the Meze Empyrean 2 is 32 ohms, which is pretty normal, but the sensitivity has actually dropped on this iteration compared to things like the Elites. And so the Empyrean 2s are rated with a sensitivity of 105 decibels, but that's decibels per volt. And when you convert that to what we're used to seeing from most manufacturers, which is decibels per milliwatt, it jumps all the way down to 90 decibels per milliwatt. So it's lower than a lot of other headphones on the market, but it's not a difficult to drive headphone. The reason I'm highlighting the difference between the 105 decibels per volt and the 90 decibels per milliwatt is that you may find if you've come from a different headphone, when you plug in the Empyrean 2, you'll probably need to turn up the volume a little bit. However, it's very easy to drive. You can get 110 decibels out of this, which is vastly too loud and very dangerous. You can get there with just 90 milliwatts. So realistically, if you have an amp on hand with 200 milliwatts, you've got way more than you need to comfortably drive these. And so with that in mind, let's start talking about sound quality. All of my testing for this review was done with the exact same source chain, whether it was the isolation listening, just getting to know the headphones, or when it came to actually doing comparisons as well. And specifically, I was using my PC as the transport. That's got a high quality JCAT USB card in it that tidies up the audio before it goes out through a tubeless Consensus USB cable. And for this testing, I was running that tubeless Consensus USB cable into a shit Yggdrasil OG DAC, and then taking the Curious XLR cables out to the Burson Audio Voyager. And on this occasion, I do think it's quite important for us to keep in mind the source chain that I used for this review. And that's because the source chain that I was using is a fairly refined source chain. It's resolving and detailed, but it is a little bit forgiving, and you'll see why I'm specifying that in just a moment. As a part of the testing for the Empyrean 2, it's worth noting that they actually also come with two different sets of pads. You get what comes installed, or at least it came installed on this pair, and that's a pair of what they call the duo pads, which is a combination of leather or leatherette on the outside. Then we move to an Alcantara type surface where it's touching against the skin, and then on the inside we've got perforated leather or leatherette again. And so these are what Meze Audio call the duo pads. But then they also provide the angled Alcantara pads that are now also what's included with the Meze Elites over behind me. And so to kickstart my listing, I've spent most of my time with the duo pads. I have gone back and forth between both, and I'll give you impressions on both in a moment, but my early impressions of the Empyrean 2 were formed with the duo pads on, and what I heard was generally a very, very good sound. Having said that, and what I'm about to say came from a wide range of use across a whole bunch of different source chains, so this bit's not source chain specific, but across a wide range of source chains, what I found was that the Empyrean 2 does have a little bit of extra emphasis around the 3 to 4 kHz mark. And that can make them just a little bit fatiguing, a little bit bitey in the treble. It's going to depend on you, your preferences, your natural sensitivities of your ear canals, but it can definitely cause the Empyrean 2 to be a less relaxing listen. And it certainly was the case for me. That's not to suggest that it's all bad and they're not a harsh or nasty headphone. It's just something I think you need to be aware of if you have a sensitivity around that sibilant band. What I mean is that's about the frequency where a lot of our vocal cues like s and t sit. And so if you are prone to finding sibilants difficult to deal with, the Empyrean 2 might be too much for you. What makes this a bit tricky though is that different people will have slightly different sensitivities anywhere between say 2 kHz and 6 kHz, and that can make it a bit tricky to work out exactly where our sensitivities lie. And this is where frequency response charts can become handy. If you know you've got a particular sensitivity on a particular headphone, you can take a look at some graphs of those headphones and see where the peaks lie. That's going to give you a good sense of where your sensitivities are. And so I happen to know that this 3 to 4K peak for me is an issue, and so it does make the Empyrean 2 just occasionally a little bit sharp in the treble. On the other hand, they do present a nice solid bass. It's nowhere near the bass monster that the old Empyreans were, and I'm a little bit sad about that, but I do also understand why Meze made the change. I think I was in the minority of people that thoroughly loved the Empyrean. I know I'm not alone, but I don't think we were a large group. And so hearing the new Empyrean 2 move a long way away from that tuning is a little bit disappointing, but I'm not going to judge them on that. I'm judging them as their very own headphone, and in that sense, I generally like them. I think the bass is good and solid for a more neutrally tuned headphone. I think the treble is generally quite good, other than the fact that they do enhance that 3 to 4K peak, as I've just spoken about. But where one of their real strengths lies is actually in their vocal presentation. The Empyrean 2 has quite a strong leaning into the mid-range, not in a way that it becomes artificial or over-enhanced, but it certainly helps to draw attention into the vocals, the mid-range, where the bulk of the musical content is. And when I say the bulk of the musical content, obviously if you do actually do a full frequency analysis of most music, the bulk of the content is in the bass. My point is where the melody often lies, the vocals and therefore the lyrics often lie, that's all in the mid-range. So where the bulk of the content in terms of the meaning, the emotion of the music, a lot of that sits in the mid-range, and that's where the Empyrean 2s definitely draw your attention. And so how I'd sum these up before we talk about the Alcantara pads is that with the duo pads on there, I think they're a slightly uneven tuning, in the sense that there's a few sort of lumps and bumps along the way, but not necessarily in a bad way. They're not unenjoyable. They've got a bit of upper bass emphasis, a little bit of mid-range emphasis, and then there's that bit of a peak around 3 to 4 kilohertz. So there are a few obvious points of enhancement, but it's also done in such a way that the transitions from the lower bass into the enhanced sort of upper bass and mids into the slight trough before you get the 3 to 4K and then up again into the treble, all of that is handled really well. So they don't sound uneven. But when you look at the frequency response, when you think about what you're hearing, what's emphasized or de-emphasized, they have definitely got some points of emphasis in there. And so all of this so far has been with the duo pads. But if we turn our attention now and look at the angled Alcantara pads, which are entirely made of Alcantara inside and out, it is perforated on the inside edge, but not anywhere else. And I don't know if you can see it here, but there is a very slight angle where the back edge is thicker than the front. So they will sit sort of slightly further off the back of the head than the front of the head. Moving over to those now, it does change the sound relatively significantly. It doesn't transform the headphone completely, but it gives it a distinctly different sense of emphasis. And specifically what I'd say is it leans further again into the mid-range, so they're a wonderful pad for vocals. Where I think there's a bit of nuance in the sound of the Alcantara pads with the Empyrean 2 though, is that they both soften the sibilance a little bit, they take a little bit of the edge off the sound, but at the same exact time, they're also boosting some of the treble frequencies. And so you get this kind of double-edged sword where the sound is a little bit less attacking, but it's also more treble oriented. So it's a bit brighter. The bass actually also rolls off a little bit more. So the overall sound is a bit brighter, but also a little bit less attacking. So it's going to come down a lot to the sorts of sound you like, how much energy you want in the sound, and also how much treble you like versus bass quantity. And it's probably worth pointing out at this time that when we talk about frequency response and the perception of a headphone as brighter or darker or bassier or more treble focused, the combination of the bass, mids and treble all play into that. So if you're looking at a frequency response graph and you're seeing a treble peak, that doesn't necessarily mean that a headphone is more bright because it happens to have a higher treble peak. If it also happens to have a bit more bass, either a more consistently high bass or a significant lump or bump in the bass, that can actually offset our perception of the difference between bass and treble and mean that a headphone with a slight treble peak and a slight bass peak may actually sound less treble focused than a headphone that looks at first glance like it has less treble overall. Because it might have less treble overall, but also taper off consistently down into the bass, you're going to get a brighter sound from that headphone. So be a little bit careful when looking at frequency response graphs and trying to kind of correlate those graphs with what people say about the headphone. There's all different ways that this can be interpreted. For example, some headphones have more bite in the treble, even though they don't have as much treble as a different headphone. For example, right here, some may hear the duo pads as being more aggressive in the treble because they have got a bit more energy, whereas there's a higher peak in the treble in the Alcantara pads and also less bass. So some will feel like the Alcantara pads are actually the brighter set on the Empyrean 2. And so the takeaway from this is that everyone's going to have a slightly different way of talking about and understanding how a frequency response and also the general character of the sound, how that all comes together. And for me, what I would say is that the duo pads on the Empyrean 2 come across as the richer, warmer sounding pad, but with a bit more bite in the top end. Whereas I would say the Alcantara pads are more vocal focused and a bit more treble focused because of the roll off in the bass, but they don't bite quite as hard. Now, neither pad on these is particularly aggressive in the treble. We're not talking high from an HE1000 SE type treble. We're talking a little bit more bitey than something like a Meze Elite that we'll talk about in a moment. And so the final thing that I should say is that I personally, with my ears, my sensitivities, my preferences, I find the Alcantara pads a little bit more fatiguing than I find the Duo pads. The extra bit of bass that you get from the Duo pads really helps to balance out the overall tonality of the Empyrean 2, despite the fact that I do find the 3 to 4 kHz peak a little bit troublesome. And that's across, as I said before, a wide range of source chains. And so the one final thing I wanted to let you know about the sound of the Empyrean 2s in isolation is that I did also try the hybrid pads from the Elites, and it really, really increases the bass, but it doesn't necessarily make the Empyrean 2 like the old Empyrean. So anyone looking for that, I don't think you're going to quite get it. I wasn't a particular fan of the sound of the Elite hybrid pads on the Empyrean 2. I think they overdid the bass, they overbalanced and unbalanced the overall tuning. And so I think the pads that come with the Empyrean 2 are the two best choices. And then it comes down to a question of whether you like the angled Alcantara or the Duo pads, or if it's not actually a headphone for you, and that's possible as well. But I think the best way for me to give you a sense of that is probably to put the Duos up against the Meze Elites. Because ultimately, I think that's the closest competition for them. They have a sound and a tuning that at the $3,000 price point, I don't think is like anything else that I've got here. I don't think they're a particularly good comparison with an HE1000 SE because it is clearly a bitier sounding headphone, that being the HE1000 SE. I also don't have the ZMF Calderas here anymore. That would have been a very interesting comparison. And for the record, I am hoping to get a pair of Calderas of my own, but for now the demo pair has gone back to ZMF. And so the best headphone that I have here in my collection for a direct comparison is the Meze Elites. I also think it might be the headphone that a lot of people are going to be thinking about this in comparison to, because a natural reaction when a new headphone comes out, like the Empyrean that's about $1,000 cheaper than the Elite, is to suddenly go, well, is this actually the better headphone? It's newer, it's got some new design revisions, is it better for less money? So let's have a chat about that and see if I can answer that question. For this testing, I was using the source chain I spoke about before with the Yggdrasil OG and the Burson Audio Voyager amplifier, so remembering it leans a little bit towards the forgiving side. And therefore, with a slightly more aggressive system, you may find that the little bit of bite that the Empyrean 2 has comes out even further still. And I don't say that to foreshadow the fact that the Elites walk all over the Empyrean 2, because they have quite a different sound. One of the tracks I listened to and made my notes on was Breaking It Slowly by George, but as is always the case, I use a lot of different tracks to form my opinions before I sit down and take notes on a single track. And listening to the Empyrean 2s on Breaking It Slowly, as you'd expect, it started off sounding fantastic. For clarity, this was with the Duo pads installed, and as you'd expect from what I've already said, the sound did have a little bit of bite. The sibilants in the vocals were a little bit aggressive from the Empyrean 2, but it wasn't to the point that it was unenjoyable, so much as it prevented me from wanting to turn it up any further. I was at the comfortable limit of where I was listening, which is probably in the range of 75 to 80 decibels. That was about the most I'd want. It's not a headphone that drew me to want to turn up the volume to really get into the music. And that's all because of that little bit of aggression around 3 to 4 kHz. As the track continued, I found that sounds like cymbals could get a little bit edgy at times as well. Again, that's going to come back to that treble emphasis. And the bass is there, but I'm not particularly aware of it in the sense that I had to think about whether the bass presence was solid. It wasn't obvious. Whereas with some other headphones, it's quite clear straight away that you've got your bass, your mid and your treble all where they're meant to be. I feel like with the Empyrean 2, the bass is just almost secondary. It's not that it's a bass light headphone, I'm not suggesting that, but it doesn't balance the bass at the same level as things like the treble and the mids. On the other hand, what that does mean is that the vocals are really nicely focused from the Empyrean 2. They let you get right into the vocal, and that's very enjoyable. Moving over to the Meze Elites then, and this is using the angled Alcantara pads on the Elites, what immediately jumped out to me was how much more open the sound is from the Elites. There was a greater sense of space around each sound, a greater sense of depth in the soundstage, and then at the same time there was also, talking about depth, more depth and presence in the bass as well. On the other hand, something else that came out from the Elites quite obviously as I switched between them was that the Elites place more emphasis in the very upper treble, up around 16 kilohertz. And so what you can find is that it does bring a slight tizziness to the treble. It's not something I tend to notice too much from them in isolation if I've just been listening to those for a while on their own. But going from the Empyrean 2, which doesn't have that, to the Elites, which do, what was happening was I was trading off the 3 to 4 kilohertz aggression, and that's probably too strong a word, but the 3 to 4 kilohertz energy from the Empyrean 2, trading that off for a slightly tizzy treble from the Elites. And so neither is perfect, but also neither is bad. They just have a little bit of coloration. They're just not a perfectly natural, perfectly transparent headphone, but then I don't know that there actually is a perfectly transparent or perfectly neutral headphone. And so where this particularly plays out between the Elites and the Empyrean 2 is that moving over to the Elites on Breaking It Slowly by George sounds like the hi-hats were just a little bit over-enhanced, over-emphasized on the Elites. Now for those of you not familiar with the Elites, this is them there. You can see they have exactly the same sort of form factor and design as the Empyrean 2, and I'll come back around and talk about that design at the very end here, but as you can see they come from the same house, the same styling, the same build quality, comfort, etc. And so as I listened more and more, going back and forth between these two headphones, what I was finding was that the Elites just gave me a slightly warmer, richer sound. Not massively, but just enough that I was consistently enjoying them a little bit more. The bass was more present, and present in the sense that I felt it was actually more natural, more accurate to what I would expect to be hearing. Now, I obviously can't say what's right or wrong. I don't know exactly how this particular track was mixed, but to me, the Elites were getting closer to the tonal balance I would expect. And some are going to immediately think, and this goes back to what I said before, some would look at the frequency response graphs of these two and wonder why I'm saying that the Elites could potentially be a richer, warmer sounding headphone, because on the graphs, it looks like they taper off faster in the bass. But it all comes down to what I said before, which is the overall frequency response. There's less treble energy in the lower treble and the upper mids from the Elites, and that helps our brains to kind of perceive the bass better rather than focusing in on those upper mids. Of course, you then do get the upper treble spike, but it's far enough away from the bass that it doesn't seem to interact with our perception. And so I think ultimately, after listening to both of these for a while, you could very easily make an argument for either of these two headphones having the better tuning. On a pure frequency response and tonality perspective, I think both have pros and cons. I'm not necessarily a fan of the 3 to 4 kilohertz spike, or it's not even a spike, but the slight emphasis from the Empyrean 2. On the other hand, I'm not necessarily a fan of the 16 kilohertz spike from the Elites. Of the two of them though, I do find the Elites slightly preferable to me. And that, as I said before, is going to vary for you and everybody else. And that's where it's really important to get a sense of the other headphones you love, where their emphasis lies, and whether that is or is not like the emphases in either of these. If we move beyond frequency response though, I think things get a little bit clearer there. And that's because to me, the Empyrean 2 doesn't give you a great sense of space compared to the Elites. It's a lovely headphone, so what I'm saying now is about the comparison between the two. In isolation on its own, I think the Empyrean 2 is very solid. But I do think if it has a weakness, it's that the soundstage isn't particularly deep, and that the sense of separation between sounds isn't particularly strong. It's not bad, it doesn't feel congested, but moving over to the Meze Elite, you certainly hear things open up. And that's true with other flagship headphones, which admittedly are more expensive, but other flagship headphones, like the Focal Utopias for instance, I do feel like the Elites, the Utopias, some of those next tier up headphones do a better job of separating the sounds out. And in fact, when I reviewed the Abyss Diana MR recently, a few people jumped on there and complained that they felt like the Empyrean 2 wasn't a better headphone than the Diana MR because they felt that it sounded a bit congested or a bit thick. And I totally get that. Compared to the Diana MR, which is very treble focused, it probably does separate sounds better. I think tonally, the Empyrean 2 is closer to true, is closer to neutral, and therefore to me is a more enjoyable headphone, but I also get where people are coming from when they say that, because there is a sense of, it's not thickness, but it's also a lacking of space around instruments in the Empyrean 2 that you don't get with something like the Elites. And indeed, you probably don't get with the Abyss Diana MR either, but that's since gone back to the distributor, so I haven't had a chance to do another round of comparisons here in this review. You'll have to go and check out the Abyss Diana MR review to hear that direct comparison. And so where all this leads us is that I am sad that Meze went away from a fun and bass-tuned headphone in the new Empyrean. It would have been great to see them just refine the bass-oriented tuning of the original Empyrean. I understand why they did it. I understand the complaints with the original Empyrean, but it would have been really fun to hear them tweak that and adjust that rather than go in what seems to be a very different direction. On the other hand, I think they've made a lovely headphone. I think this is a headphone at $3,000 that many people are going to buy, enjoy. It's going to be their endgame perfect headphone. For me, I do think it's held back just a little bit by the lack of sense of space and depth in the soundstage. It's not a flat wall of sound. I don't think I've clarified that. It's not like, say, the Abyss Diana MR that I mentioned before that I found quite flat in the soundstage. The Empyrean 2 does have some depth and layering. I just would have liked a greater sense of overall space and even more depth again. That would have made it perfect. But as is the case, I think it's a lovely headphone at $3,000. I think it's probably one of the best around in that price point. Obviously, you do have competitors like the HE1000 SE, but some people are going to struggle with the treble from that one, even more than the treble from this one. And so in that kind of ballpark price of $3,000, this is currently one of the best I've tried. Now, I do hope to try the Modhouse Tungsten very soon. That's obviously going to be a competitor because I'm hearing very, very good things about that, and it's even cheaper than this. But for now, based on the price and what else I've heard, I do think the Empyrean 2 is a really strong option. And so just to wrap things up, a couple of final things that I should talk about if you're not familiar with the range from Meze Audio already, is just how great the build quality is from these. Meze have absolutely nailed it. This goes all the way back to the original Empyrean, then the Elites, now the Empyrean 2. These are probably the most comfortable headphones on the market. And that comes down to a number of things. First of all, the pads are plush, they're a good size, they're a lovely shape, but then you've also got this beautiful, interestingly bent style suspension band, and the whole idea of this bend is that it spreads the weight more across the headband and it stops it from just being a single point of contact on top of the head. If you then add to that the build quality of these, which is nothing short of spectacular, it's a very, very premium experience wearing and listening to any set of Meze Audio headphones. So I definitely love that. I definitely think these are absolutely spectacular to live with as long as you like the sound quality. The other couple of things that I wanted to mention is that when you're changing the pads on these, it's a wonderful system where you just pop off the pads. They use a magnetic system, which apparently also helps in the magnetic fields for the actual driver. So you can just pop them off, pop the new ones on. It means that if you ever do need to replace pads, it's very easy to do. One little note, do make sure that the pad has sealed all the way around the side. I noticed when I was doing my measurements that some of the measurements were really wonky in the base, and what had happened was that the pad was just sitting a couple of millimeters off from pushing on properly, and that will throw off the sound quality quite significantly. So if you get a pair of these and you think they sound wonky, just check the pads before you jump to any conclusions. And now the very last thing I'm going to mention is what these come with, and that is that you can order them with either the silver-plated upgrade cable or the copper upgrade cable. All my testing for this review was done with the silver-plated. I don't have the copper cable here, and indeed, I actually think the copper cable might suit these better than the silver-plated. So if you've tried the copper cable with them, let us know in the comments down below. I generally find that silver-plated cables bring a little bit of extra energy, a little bit of extra aggression, and so hearing them with the Meze Audio copper cable might be really interesting. It would be great if anyone that's tried that can leave a note down below about their experiences. What I love about this though is that it used to be that you had to buy this cable, in my opinion, to get the most out of these headphones. The stock cables they came with were okay, but only okay. Whereas these upgrade cables really do bring out a bit more sound quality, detail and resolution from these Meze Audio headphones. All of that, being the headphones, the pads, etc., also goes in a lovely black solid carry case. So if you want to protect them when you're not using them, or if you like to travel with your headphones, they also come with one of the best, but also the biggest, hard cases on the market. I like the fact they've gone away from the full briefcase size down to a slightly thicker, but also sort of smaller footprint style case. It is still a very large case though, if that matters to you. And so with all that said, as you've probably gathered, I think the Empyrean 2 is a really solid, very enjoyable headphone. It hasn't captured my heart the way the original Empyrean does. For me, it's also not as good as the more expensive Meze Elite. And so there is a reason for Meze to continue having the two tiers of headphones because I think they serve different needs, different tastes, and different quality and price levels. That said, I think the Empyrean 2 is one of the best headphones around at $3,000. And so if you're having a think about it, if you're on the fence about it, then hopefully what I've described today has helped you work out if it's a good fit for you or not. And I think to me, if I had to sum the headphone up in one word, I think it's a headphone that I would recommend for those that really love getting into a great vocal quality headphone, and don't mind a little bit of extra sizzle, a little bit of extra energy around that sibilant range, and then either with slightly rolled off bass in the case of the Alcantara pads, or with a fairly linear but very slightly secondary bass in the case of the duo pads. So if that sounds like you, check out the Empyrean 2 for yourself. I'll put links down below, of course, where you can go and buy them, you can read up more on them, etc. And as always, if you have found the video useful, helpful, or interesting, then please hit the like button and subscribe and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.